Welcome to Top 10 Secret, your gateway to the most chilling horror stories. Do you have the courage to step into a world of unsolved mysteries? At Top 10 Secret, we bring you spine-chilling horror stories. From supernatural encounters and cursed legends to eerie disappearances, each video takes you deeper into the darkness, where the truth may be even scarier than fiction. Get ready, because what you're about to hear might haunt you forever. Story 1. Have you ever felt someone touch you, only to turn around and find no one there? Claire experienced that every time she stepped into her grandmother's basement. But one night, she made the mistake of ignoring the warning. And then, those hands didn't just touch her anymore. If you love chilling stories like this, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Ghost Hand. Claire stood in front of her grandmother's old house, where she was about to start a new chapter of her life. The house bore the marks of time. Faded wooden walls, foggy glass windows, and an eerie silence that clung to the air. From the moment she moved in, something felt off. It wasn't just the old architecture or the emptiness. It was the unsettling chill in the atmosphere, the feeling of invisible eyes watching her every move. From the very first day, she noticed something strange about the basement stairs. Every time she stepped down, a shiver ran down her spine, goosebumps rising along her arms. And when her foot touched the last step, a cold sensation brushed against her ankle. Claire flinched, turning sharply, but there was nothing there. No draft, no insects, no sign of anything touching her. Just a dimly lit space, rough concrete walls, and dusty shelves under the weak glow of the basement light. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination. But day after day, the sensation returned. Whenever she went downstairs to retrieve something or check the electrical box, she would feel it again. Something lightly brushing against her skin, cold and fleeting, like a hand grazing past her. She would freeze in place, holding her breath, straining to hear any sound. But there was nothing. Nothing except the pounding of her own heartbeat. The growing unease made her recall her grandmother's warning. Never go into the basement after dark. At the time, Claire thought it was just superstition or an attempt to keep her away from the dust and cobwebs. But now, every trip down those stairs made her more convinced. Something unseen was waiting down there. She decided to test it. One evening, as the last traces of daylight faded, Claire stood before the basement door, her hand trembling over the doorknob. Part of her wanted to push past the fear, to prove that this was all in her head. But deep inside, her instinct screamed at her to run. Taking a deep breath, she slowly turned the knob. A gust of icy air seeped out, chilling her skin. The darkness inside swallowed the light from the hallway. She reached for the switch. The bulb flickered a few times before stabilizing, casting a dim glow over the creaky wooden staircase. Swallowing hard, Claire placed one foot down, then another, carefully making her way downward. The moment she reached the fourth step, she froze. Something was touching her, not just a passing chill or an eerie sensation. This time, she felt it clearly. A cold hand gripping her ankle. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her throat went dry, and every muscle in her body locked in place. 1 second, 2 seconds. Forcing herself to stay calm, she gathered the courage to look down. There was nothing. But the feeling remained. An invisible grip, skeletal fingers tightening around her skin. Claire screamed, jerking her foot away. She stumbled backward, barely catching herself before hitting the floor. Panting, wide-eyed, she stared at the steps, at the exact spot where she had felt the touch. But there was only dust, wood, and the dim, flickering light. She scrambled back up, slamming the basement door shut. And in that very moment, a sound whispered from the other side. A voice. "Stay with us. A chill ran through Claire's entire body. She held her breath, pressing her back against the door as if something might burst through it at any second. The air grew heavy, suffocating, pressing against her chest. A breeze swept through the hallway, carrying the scent of damp wood and something else. Something old, something decayed. She bolted to her room, locking the door behind her. But even under her blankets, curled up on her bed, she couldn't stop shaking. That night, Claire didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Wind howled through the window cracks. Tree branches scraped against the roof, and somewhere in the house, a whisper so faint it was barely more than a breath. "We are still here." Claire clutched her blanket, cold sweat trickling down her temple. She had made a mistake. She had awakened something beneath the basement. The forgotten warning. Claire stood in the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the basement door. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her mind. Never go into the basement after dark. Those words had once seemed like nothing more than an old superstition, but now they sent a wave of unease through her. Since moving into the house, strange things had been happening. The cold, ghostly touches on her ankles, the feeling of being watched, the oppressive air whenever she approached the basement stairs. But tonight, she had no choice. She needed to retrieve an old box of photos before mailing them out in the morning. Clenching her fists, she tried to push away her irrational fear. It's just a basement. Claire took a deep breath, opened the door, and was immediately met with a gust of icy air. She shivered but stepped forward anyway. The basement light flickered a few times before making a faint clicking noise and stabilizing, casting a dim yellowish glow over the dust-covered walls. She descended carefully, each step echoing through the silence. The deeper she went, the heavier the air felt. The cold was thick, pressing against her skin. A few steps from the bottom, the familiar sensation returned. Cold. Ice cold. Claire froze in place, unable to move. And then it happened. A touch, damp, freezing, right around her ankle. Her breath hitched. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She looked down at her bare feet against the worn wooden steps. Nothing. No one was there. No sign of anything touching her. But the sensation remained. A light pressure, as if invisible fingers were slowly tightening around her ankle, creeping, gripping, clinging. This wasn't her imagination. Her breaths turned shallow, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the railing. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to flee, but her body was paralyzed by sheer terror. Don't panic. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. She shut her eyes, took a sharp breath, then yanked her foot away. Nothing held her back. This time, she didn't hesitate. She hurried down the last few steps, scanning the room for the photo box, trying to ignore the fear crawling up her spine. But just as she reached for it, the overhead light flickered violently, then died. Darkness swallowed the room. Claire stood frozen. The silence pressed against her. Then, in the suffocating stillness, a whisper. Software faint. Stay with us. Claire's throat tightened, her skin prickling with dread. A cold breath ghosted against the back of her neck, as if someone were standing just behind her. She didn't dare turn around. Then suddenly, a hand clamped onto her shoulder. Claire screamed, flailing to break free. But there was more than one hand. They emerged from the darkness. Thin, skeletal, ice-cold fingers. They grabbed her, pulled, dragged her toward the farthest wall. The shadows thickened, swirling like black mist, consuming everything. The wall in front of her was no longer solid. It rippled like water, yet it was as frigid as ice. Claire thrashed, desperate, but the hands tightened their grip, pulling her closer. Closer. The whispers came again, louder this time, overlapping, relentless, suffocating. Stay with us. No, she couldn't let this happen. In her panic, she suddenly remembered her grandmother's rosary in her pocket. Her trembling fingers fumbled through the darkness, her heart pounding so violently it echoed in her head. Then, her fingers found the beads. Claire clutched it tight and yanked it out, holding it high. The hands recoiled instantly. A piercing screech ripped through the air. The shadows convulsed, retreating into the wavering wall. She didn't waste a second. She bolted. Claire raced up the stairs, taking them two at a time, the whispers shrieking behind her. She barely made it through the door before slamming it shut. Silence. Chest heaving, hands shaking. She pressed against the door, her heart still hammering wildly. She had escaped. But had she really? Because in that moment, through the crack beneath the door, a chill seeped into the room. And in the dead of night, she still heard it. A whisper. We will return. The buried truth. Claire sat on her bed, her fingers still clutching her grandmother's rosary. She couldn't sleep. The events in the basement replayed in her mind like a never-ending nightmare. The cold hands, the whispering voices, the wall rippling like water. She knew she couldn't stay in this house any longer. Something was down there. Something that didn't belong to this world. At dawn, Claire called a priest. She wasn't sure if he would believe her story, but she didn't care. She just wanted whatever was haunting this place to be gone. The priest arrived at noon, carrying a crucifix and a vial of holy water. As Claire led him down to the basement, both of them immediately sensed a change in the air. It wasn't as freezing as the night before, but a heavy, suffocating presence lingered, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The priest silently examined the space. He sprinkled holy water around the basement, murmuring prayers in a calm, steady voice. Claire stood beside him, hands clenched, heart pounding in her chest. Then suddenly, the priest stopped. He was staring at a corner of the basement. Claire swallowed hard. What is it? The priest didn't answer right away. He took slow steps toward the wall, crouching down to press his hand against the cold concrete. A thin crack ran along the surface, as if something had once struck it with force. Then he spoke. There's something behind this wall. A chill crawled down Claire's spine. She stepped back, her pulse hammering. What do you mean? The priest turned to her, his expression grave. We need to open it. Claire's throat went dry. She didn't want to. Every instinct screamed not to touch it. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't run forever. With the priest's help, they began breaking through the wall. Chunks of debris fell away, revealing a dark void beyond. A gust of icy air rushed out, carrying the foul stench of decay. Claire covered her nose, fighting the nausea rising in her throat as the light gradually illuminated what lay inside. And then she saw them. Skeletons. Dozens of human remains piled on top of one another, their hollow eye sockets seeming to stare straight at her. Claire staggered back, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps, terror spreading through her veins. But the worst part wasn't the bones themselves. It was their positions. Every single skeleton had its hands reaching toward the wall, as if they had once tried to claw their way out but never made it. A shudder ran down Claire's spine. She turned to the priest, but his face was just as pale. He made the sign of the cross, murmured a prayer, and quickly began sprinkling holy water over the remains. The moment the droplets touched the bones, the entire room trembled. A freezing wind howled from within the wall. The voices returned, echoing through the basement. Help us. We tried to escape. We were trapped. Claire screamed, stumbling toward the stairs. The skeletons began to move. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The bony fingers twitched. They reached out. The remains shifted as if trying to crawl out of the wall. The priest shouted, raising the crucifix high as he chanted louder. Holy water splashed across the basement, and the voices shrieked in agony. The entire space trembled, a swirling black mist rising from the skeletons, twisting into a nightmarish vortex. Then, silence. The wind stopped. The skeletons lay still. The whispers were gone. The basement became eerily quiet. Claire gasped for air, her legs shaking beneath her. She turned to the priest, who was still gripping the crucifix tightly. They had done it. But just as she thought it was over, a faint chill seeped from the crack in the wall. And in the dead silence, a whisper drifted through the air. "We are still here." Claire froze. Dread crashed over her once more. She knew. This wasn't over. Endless nightmare. Claire packed in a frenzy. Clothes were shoved hastily into her suitcase, books scattered across the floor. She didn't care anymore. She had to get out. Now, after everything that had happened in the basement, Claire knew this house could never be safe. The trapped souls behind the wall, the sorrowful whispers, the cold hands dragging her into the darkness. She couldn't stay another second. The sun had already set. She could feel the night creeping in from the outside. And she knew. Darkness was when they were strongest. She zipped her suitcase, grabbed it, and rushed downstairs. Each footstep echoed through the empty house. But Claire didn't stop. She didn't want to listen. Didn't want to feel anything anymore. She reached the front door, and then it slammed shut. Claire gasped, her heart hammering. She gripped the doorknob and yanked. It wouldn't budge. She twisted the lock. It didn't move. Her breaths came faster. She stepped back, trembling as she looked around. The air in the house was colder now. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, and then footsteps. Not hers, someone else's, or something else's. Right behind her. Claire spun around. No one was there, but she could feel it. An unseen presence lurking in the darkness, watching her. The lights flickered. The whispers returned. "We told you. You can't leave. Stay with us." Claire clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head. No. Let me go." But the voices only came closer. Then something touched her shoulder. Cold. Icy. Claire screamed and lunged for the window. She pounded on the glass, but it wouldn't break. She scanned the room for her phone. The screen was black. No signal. And then she heard it. A sound from the basement. She froze. Something was climbing the stairs. Click. Click. Claire didn't dare turn around, but she could feel it. It was coming. And this time, it wouldn't let her escape. Her eyes darted around, searching for another way out. The kitchen, the back door. She ran as fast as she could, but before she reached it, the basement door burst open. A wave of freezing air swept over her. Bony hands emerged from the darkness. They lunged for her. Claire screamed, stumbling back, but a hand clamped around her ankle. Ice cold. Unrelenting. She crashed to the floor. The skeletal fingers dug into her skin, dragging her toward the basement. She kicked and clawed, but the grip was too strong. More hands appeared. Faces surfaced in the darkness. Hollow eye sockets. Cracked jaws moving as if whispering something. Stay, no, Claire screamed, thrashing. She couldn't be pulled down there. She couldn't. In her panic, her hand brushed against something in her pocket, her grandmother's rosary. Without thinking, she raised it high. A piercing shriek filled the air. The hands recoiled. The shadows writhed, trembling, then vanished into nothing. Claire didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet and ran for the door. This time, it opened. She burst outside, gasping for air, her heart pounding like a drum. Behind her, the house door slammed shut. Everything fell silent. But Claire knew it was still there, waiting. And every night, when the cold wind brushed against her skin, she could still feel that hand. It never really let go. The darkness isn't over. Claire stood in the middle of the road, breath shaky, legs trembling as if they could barely hold her up. She was out. She had really escaped. But was it truly over? The house still stood there, alone in the darkness. Its windows, pitch black and hollow like empty eye sockets, watched her every move. The darkness inside was still alive, still waiting. She couldn't stay any longer. She climbed into her car, shoved the key into the ignition. But the moment she turned it, the engine wouldn't start. She tried again. Once. Twice. Nothing but silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees, whispering eerie secrets through the night. Claire gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing herself to stay calm. She couldn't go back to that house. Then, the windows fogged up. Claire froze. Her breath caught in her throat as a handprint appeared on the glass. Thin, bony, right outside the car. Panic surged through her. She wiped at the window with her sleeve, but the handprint vanished the moment she touched it. A chill crawled down her spine. She was being watched. Then a whisper. This time, not in her head. Inside the car. Claire, her heart stopped. She was not alone. Hands shaking, she fumbled for the door handle, flung it open, and stumbled out. But the moment her feet hit the ground, something grabbed her ankle, ice cold, unseen. She screamed, kicking frantically. But there was nothing there. No one. Only the numbing, freezing grip that wouldn't let go. She ran from the house, ran from the nightmare. Darkness pressed in around her, but she didn't stop. Only when she reached the glow of the streetlights did she dare to look back. The house stood still, silent as if nothing had ever happened. But Claire knew. It was still there. It had never left. It was still waiting. Years later, Claire left town, trying to forget, trying to convince herself it had all been a nightmare. But every night, lying in the darkness of her room, she could still feel it. The icy chill against her skin, the whisper right beside her ear, and worst of all, the light touch of a hand brushing against her ankle. This nightmare would never end. The call from the darkness years had passed since that horrific night, but Claire could never forget. She had run. She had tried to escape that house, but the memories clung to her like a curse that refused to fade. Every night, the image of that basement, the piles of bones, the skeletal hands reaching out from the shadows, came back to haunt her. And worst of all, the voice. Claire. A whisper, soft yet echoing deep within her mind. At first, she thought it was just a dream. But then, the strange occurrences began. She heard footsteps in the hallway, even though she lived alone. The lights flickered every night, despite the electrician assuring her there was nothing wrong. Her bedroom door creaked open at midnight, revealing a hallway swallowed in pitch-black darkness. Claire tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But then, one night, she woke up from a nightmare, and something was standing at the foot of her bed. A shadow. Formless. Faceless. But she could feel it watching her. The air turned icy cold, as if all warmth had been drained from the room. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, the shadow began to move. Slow, deliberate. It crawled onto the bed. Claire panicked, bolting upright and switching on the light. But there was nothing there. Just her, alone in an empty room. But she knew. She wasn't truly alone. It had found her. things only got worse in the following days. She saw a figure passing behind her in the mirror while she washed her face. Bruises appeared on her arms, as if someone had grabbed her tightly in her sleep. And the worst part, the knocking at midnight. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Claire held her breath. She didn't dare move, didn't dare get out of bed. But the knocking continued, growing louder. Bang, bang, bang. Then a voice. Claire, open the door. A hoarse whisper, familiar yet distorted. Unable to take it anymore, she rushed to the door, flung it open. No one was there, only darkness. But as she stepped back, a freezing gust of air swept past her, carrying a scent. Damp, rotting, familiar. The smell of the basement beneath the old house. Claire broke down in tears. She had run so far, but it had still found her. She could never escape. The darkness had claimed her. Forever. The endless curse. Claire curled up in the corner of the room, arms wrapped tightly around her head, desperately trying to block out the sound. But it was useless. The whispers still came. Claire, stop hiding. Did you really think you could escape? You belong there. Come back. The room was dark, lit only by the dim glow of the streetlights outside, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Her heart pounded, breath ragged, throat dry as if something was strangling her. The air around her grew colder, heavier. She knew. It was still here. She could feel it. The thing that had escaped that house with her. At first, Claire thought that leaving that place would put an end to everything. But she was wrong. She had awakened it. And every night, it came closer. From the darkness in her home. From the mirror in her bathroom. From the corners where light could never reach. And tonight, it was near. A shiver ran down her spine as she felt a cold breath against the back of her neck. Something was standing behind her. Her throat tightened. She didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. And then a hand rested lightly on her shoulder. Cold. Icy. Claire screamed, scrambling to her feet, bolting out of the room. She raced down the stairs, her heartbeat frantic, bare feet pounding against the wooden floor. But the footsteps weren't hers alone. It was chasing her. She dashed into the kitchen, grabbed a knife from the counter, and spun around. Nothing, but she knew it was there. That feeling, like 100 invisible eyes watching her from the darkness. She backed away, cold sweat dripping down her spine. And then, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. She held her breath. The silence was too deep. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, creak, 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 right in front of her, in the darkness. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Fear clenched around her mind, paralyzing her. Then, from within the pitch-black void, a voice whispered, "Claire, have you forgotten?" Distorted, distant, yet so close. She couldn't breathe. A shadowy figure emerged. Something was coming. There was no time to think. Claire turned and lunged for the door. She fumbled with the lock, yanked it open. It wouldn't budge. "You can't escape." The voice murmured right next to her ear. Cold. A phantom hand brushed through her hair. Claire sobbed. She didn't want to die. But before she could react, an unseen force dragged her backward. She crashed onto the floor. The room spun. Darkness consumed everything. And then, a face appeared, pale, twisted, hollow eyes, a mouth gaping in a silent scream. That hand gripped her, cold, unyielding. She screamed in sheer terror, and then everything went black. The next morning, Claire's apartment was found abandoned. Nothing was disturbed, no signs of struggle. But there was one strange detail. The front door was still locked from the inside, and on the bedroom mirror, a faint handprint remained. cold, icy. The abyss of darkness. No one knew where Claire had gone. She disappeared as if she had never existed. No trace, no message left behind. Her apartment remained untouched, everything perfectly in place, except for the absence of life. The police got involved. They searched every inch looking for signs of Claire, but all the doors were locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no struggle. The room was too perfect, too silent, as if Claire had simply faded away. But there was something strange. The mirror in her bedroom was covered in fog, even though the heating had been off for days. And on the glass surface, there was a single handprint. Cold. Faint. Jake, Claire's best friend, refused to accept the truth. He knew Claire would never just disappear without a word. She had told him about the strange things she felt, the dreams, the whispers, the unseen presence lurking in the darkness. But he hadn't believed her. Now she was gone, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. He had to find her, even if it meant facing something he had never believed was real. That night, Jake snuck into Claire's apartment. Everything was exactly as she had left it, except for the suffocating silence hanging in the air. He could feel a strange coldness seeping into his skin. Then, footsteps echoed from the bedroom. Jake froze. He knew for a fact he was alone in the apartment, but something was moving. Slowly, he stepped toward the bedroom door, his hands clenched into fists. The door was unlocked. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. The room was pitch dark. Only the streetlight outside cast eerie shadows on the walls. And then, Claire's mirror. It caught his eye immediately. It stood there, perfectly in place on the dresser. But the reflection was pure black. Jake felt his scalp prickle. The mirror reflected the room, but not him. There was no reflection of him in the glass. A chill ran down his spine. Cautiously, he stepped closer. But just as he got within a few feet, fog suddenly spread across the mirror's surface. Jake stumbled back, his heart pounding. And then, a handprint appeared on the glass. A pale hand, fingers unnaturally long, nails sharp like claws. It pressed against the mirror from the inside. Jake gasped, his body paralyzed in fear. Then the hand began tearing through the glass. A shrill, ear-piercing sound filled the room. Jake couldn't believe what he was seeing. The mirror was no longer a mirror. It was a gateway, and something inside was trying to break through. A face emerged, pale, hollow-eyed, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Jake couldn't move. He wanted to run, but his body was frozen in place. Then, a familiar voice called out, "Jake, help me." Jake's breath hitched. It was Claire. She was inside, trapped in there. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't abandon her in that abyss of darkness. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jake reached out and touched the glass, ice cold, like touching nothingness. He took a deep breath, bracing himself. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the mirror, grabbing his wrist, and pulled. Jake screamed, struggling to break free. But the grip was too strong. The darkness inside the mirror began spilling out, crawling across the floor, wrapping around his legs. It wasn't going to let him go. Jake thrashed against it, but it was useless. The shadows consumed him. He felt himself being dragged deeper, deeper. The room disappeared. Everything disappeared. Only endless darkness remained. And Claire's voice, distant, desperate. "Jake, you shouldn't have come here." Then everything faded into nothingness. No way out. Darkness consumed Jake. He couldn't tell if he was falling or being pulled into an endless void. The coldness pierced through his skin, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His heart pounded wildly, his body constricted by an invisible force. Then suddenly, he hit the ground. Jake gasped, his eyes wide open in the darkness. A thick, misty fog surrounded him, chilling and dense, as if he had stepped into another world. Lifeless, lightless, with no way out. "Jake?" A whisper echoed all around him. Jake spun around. A figure stood not far from him. Claire. She looked pale, her eyes hollow, her face twisted in terror. Her clothes were disheveled, her skin deathly white as if all life had been drained from her. "Claire!" Jake called out, rushing toward her, but the closer he got, the farther she seemed to drift away. "No, don't come closer." Her voice trembled, weak and distant. Jake stopped. His chest tightened as he saw her standing in the middle of a swirling darkness, as if it was slowly devouring her. "They won't let me go," Claire whispered. Jake clenched his fists. He couldn't leave her behind. He came here to save her. But before he could move, something stirred behind him. Jake froze. A breath of ice-cold air brushed against his neck. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned around, and he saw it. A twisted entity loomed behind him. Its form was undefined, shifting like a mass of thick, living shadows. Mouths contorted and writhed across its face. Empty eyes bore into him. And then, it smiled. Its grin stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Jake didn't have time to scream. The darkness swallowed him whole. It felt like he was being torn apart, piece by piece. And just when he thought it was over, Claire screamed, "No, run, Jake!" A strange force exploded from within her, driving back the darkness that had ensnared him. In that brief moment, Jake saw her eyes, no longer filled with fear, but with fierce determination. She was sacrificing herself to push him out of this place. "No, Claire!" Jake lunged forward, but it was too late. The shadows surged like a tidal wave. Claire was swallowed whole. "Claire!" Jake screamed. But then, everything vanished. Jake jolted upright. He gasped for air, his body drenched in sweat. The dark world was gone. He was back in Claire's bedroom. The room was silent, untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. No broken mirror, no creeping shadows. Only one thing had changed. The mirror on the vanity was empty. It reflected nothing, as if it had lost its soul. Jake staggered to his feet, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. He bolted out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. But just as he shut the door, a whisper echoed from inside. "Jake." He froze. His blood turned to ice. Then, in the mirror's surface, Claire's handprint appeared. And beneath it, faint words slowly emerged. "Don't come back." Story 2. Have you ever found yourself in a seemingly ordinary situation that led to a chilling truth? Join us as we uncover the story of David, a man who accidentally stumbles into an abandoned motel and comes face to face with the most terrifying experience of his life. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more spine-chilling stories. Final stop. Under the still night sky, an empty road stretched endlessly, with only the sound of the wind howling through the barren trees. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his weary eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of life. But suddenly the car shuddered violently before coming to a complete stop. He frowned, turning the key again, but it was useless. Out of gas. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he was stranded in a completely desolate place, with no passing cars in sight. Scanning his surroundings, he spotted an old building across the road, a small, abandoned motel standing eerily still in the darkness. Its broken windows, crumbling walls covered in moss, and a tilted sign with barely legible letters sent a wave of unease through him. But with no other choice, David pulled his coat tighter around him and made his way toward the motel, hoping someone inside could help. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open. The interior was unnervingly silent. The front desk was covered in dust, and a small bell resting on the counter was coated in time's decay. No one was there. David called out, his voice echoing against the lifeless walls. The unnatural stillness made his skin crawl, but exhausted and desperate, he decided to find a room for the night. As he walked down the long hallway, he noticed old portraits hanging on the walls. A thick layer of dust clung to them, but the faces remained visible. Strange, unsettling faces. Their dark, hollow eyes seemed to follow his every move. A chill crept up his spine as he realized that no matter where he stood, their gazes never wavered. His heartbeat quickened, but he dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Finally, he found a slightly ajar door. Pushing it open, he sighed in relief at the sight of an old but usable bed. Without overthinking, he locked the door, threw himself onto the mattress, and shut his eyes, trying to shake off the eerie feeling gnawing at his senses. In his restless sleep, he vaguely sensed something. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps echoing through the hallway. Slowly, methodically, getting closer, then stopping. Right outside his door, the air in the room grew thick, his heartbeat pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. But nothing happened. Just silence. After what felt like an eternity, exhaustion overtook him and he drifted into deeper sleep. Morning light filtered weakly through the window, waking David. He rubbed his eyes, the weight of unease still pressing on him. Stepping out of the room, he felt the lingering dread of the night before. This time, as he walked down the hallway, he looked closer at the portraits on the walls. His pulse pounded as a horrifying truth took shape. They weren't paintings. They were windows, and the faces he had seen weren't portraits. They were people, standing outside, watching him all night long. David's body froze, every hair on his neck standing on end. His breath caught in his throat as the realization sank in. He had spent the night in a house full of silent, unseen watchers, unaware of their presence. Panic surged through him as he bolted for the front door, only to find it locked from the outside. The portraits, the windows, still framed shadowy figures beyond the glass. Watching, waiting, and then they started to move. Under the dense night sky, darkness swallowed everything in sight, leaving only the sound of the wind howling through the barren treetops. David pulled his coat tighter around himself, his eyes straining to find shelter in the middle of this desolate stretch of road. His car lay motionless behind him, stranded in isolation, with no hope of passing vehicles offering assistance. He scanned his surroundings, and then, across the road, an old building caught his eye. A small, run-down motel with a rusted tin roof and crumbling walls. A place long forgotten by time. A creeping unease settled in his chest, but exhaustion dulled his instincts. What other choice did he have? Either go inside and hope to find help or stay out here in the cold. Alone. Taking a deep breath, he pushed aside his uneasy thoughts and stepped toward the building. Each footstep echoed against the empty road, blending with the mournful wails of the wind. As he neared the entrance, he noticed the motel's faded sign, its letters worn down to near illegibility, as if it too had been slowly erased by time. He reached for the heavy wooden door and pushed. A sharp creak shattered the silence, sending a chill down his spine. Inside, darkness consumed the main lobby. A dusty reception desk sat motionless in the corner, its thick layer of grime proof that no one had stepped foot here in ages. The air was heavy with dampness, tinged with something more unsettling. A faint, unpleasant odor, like the scent of decay long since settled into the walls. David approached the desk, knocking lightly on its surface. No response. He tilted his head, listening, but only silence greeted him. Though something felt undeniably off about this place, exhaustion overruled his caution. He had no choice but to venture deeper inside, searching for a room to rest in. Walking down the long, dimly lit hallway, he felt an unnatural chill creep over his skin, despite the night outside not being particularly cold. His footsteps echoed, bouncing off the walls in an eerie rhythm. For a brief moment, he had the unsettling sensation that another set of footsteps trailed just behind his own. He turned abruptly. Nothing. Only the endless shadowed corridor stretching behind him. Then, something else caught his attention. The portraits lining the walls. Covered in dust, they depicted strange, unfamiliar faces. Their eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to follow his every move. A prickling unease crawled over his skin, his pulse quickening. He picked up his pace, forcing himself not to look at them, yet the sensation of being watched clung to him like a shadow. At the end of the hallway, he found a slightly open door. Inside was a small, sparsely furnished room. A single bed, a tiny window with heavy curtains drawn shut. Ignoring the unsettling atmosphere, David stepped inside, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. He shut his eyes, willing himself to sleep, but the room felt too quiet, unnaturally so. Then, somewhere in the stillness, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging across the hallway floor. They stopped, right outside his door. His breath hitched, his body frozen in place. He strained to listen. Nothing. But he could feel it. Someone standing just beyond the door, close enough that only a thin slab of wood separated them. The seconds crawled by, stretching into an eternity. No knocking, no movement, just the overwhelming presence of something waiting. David clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe, convincing himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Eventually, his body succumbed to weariness, pulling him into a restless sleep. But that night, he dreamed of faces. Dozens of dark, hollow eyes watching him through the window. Not paintings, not illusions. Real, observing. When he awoke, weak morning light filtered through the window. The daylight should have been comforting, yet unease still gripped him. He pushed himself up, stepped out into the hallway, and glanced once more at the portraits. This time, when he looked closely, he noticed something horrifying. They weren't paintings, they were windows, and the faces he had seen last night. They weren't portraits on the walls. They were people, standing outside, watching him. His breath caught, a cold wave of terror surging through his veins. His eyes darted around, panic setting in. Shadows still clung to the corners of the motel, as if the daylight had never truly reached this place. And then, in that bone-chilling moment, a sound echoed through the hallway. A knock. Software slow, coming from the far end of the corridor. Under the dim glow of the aging light fixtures, David stood before the reception desk, his eyes scanning the eerily silent space. A thick layer of dust coated the countertop, and a small service bell sat undisturbed, as if untouched for years. There were no sounds beyond the wind slipping through the cracks in the door. No receptionist, no sign of life. A creeping unease settled in his chest, but exhaustion dulled his ability to fully process the strangeness of it all. He called out, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. "Is anyone here?" His words echoed through the empty lobby, but no answer came. Only the heavy stillness remained, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. David inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. He turned to leave the desk and look elsewhere, but then his eyes caught something. A hallway stretched beyond the reception area, disappearing into darkness. A door at the entrance of the hall was slightly ajar, its narrow opening swallowing the light from the lobby. The door was open. He didn't remember seeing it that way when he first walked in. A shiver crawled down his spine. Had it always been like that? Maybe it was just his imagination, or perhaps the wind had nudged it open. But he had no other choice. He couldn't stand here waiting for someone who might never come. He needed a place to rest, and if there was someone beyond that door, maybe they could help. His footsteps echoed softly against the worn floor as he approached the hallway. The space beyond was pitch black, with only the faintest slivers of light from the lobby illuminating the yellowed walls and the framed pictures lining them. David placed a hand on the door and pushed it open a little farther. A long, drawn-out creak shattered the silence, sending an involuntary chill through his body. His throat went dry, his heart pounding as he peered inside. A long hallway. It stretched deep into the building, vanishing into darkness. No signs of life, and yet it didn't look completely abandoned either. That was what disturbed him the most. It looked as though someone still lived here, silently, unseen. David pressed forward, forcing himself to ignore the unease gnawing at his gut. As he moved deeper, he noticed the framed portraits on the walls. Strange, unfamiliar faces, their eyes dark and vacant, yet carrying an unnatural sense of presence. A prickling sensation crept over his skin. He tried to convince himself they were just ordinary paintings, but a chilling thought wormed its way into his mind. Something wasn't right. No matter where he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in those portraits were watching him. His breathing quickened. An inexplicable cold slithered down his spine. Slowly, he turned his head, glancing back toward the lobby, where the faint light still spilled in. Nothing had changed. No one was there. But when he turned back toward the hallway, his heart nearly stopped. One of the portraits was missing. David took a step back, his breath hitching in his throat. He blinked, unable to process what he was seeing. A painting couldn't just move on its own. It wasn't possible. He scanned the hallway, searching for any sign that someone had tampered with it. But there was nothing. Had it moved by itself? No. That was ridiculous. He had to stay rational. Fatigue and the dim lighting were playing tricks on his mind. Maybe the angle had changed, or maybe he had misremembered its position. Then, something even worse happened. From the end of the hallway, a sound emerged. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Each step dragging slightly against the floor, as if someone was walking toward him. David froze. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. He swallowed hard, eyes locked on the shadows ahead. There was nothing there, but the sound. It kept coming. Step by step by step. He couldn't take it anymore. Turning on his heel, he bolted back toward the reception area. But the moment he reached the lobby, a new wave of terror seized him. The portraits, they weren't the same. The eyes, they were looking directly at him. Not with the lifeless stare of an old painting, but with awareness. Something was here. Something was watching him, and it was no longer hiding. David burst into the small room, slamming the door shut behind him, his back pressing against the cold wood. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest rising and falling in sheer panic. What he had just seen, it couldn't be explained. It couldn't be real. And yet, the feeling of being watched clung to him like an invisible shadow. His eyes darted around the room. It was simple. Just an old bed with a dust-covered sheet, a small wooden table by the window, and a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The faint glow from outside cast distorted shadows on the floor, making everything feel even more unsettling. He told himself he just needed to rest for a moment. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, worn down by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of this place. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the feeling wouldn't go away. It was as if something lurked within the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. David moved toward the window, hesitantly pulling the curtain aside. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, the twisted branches of leafless trees swaying in the cold wind. Then a shiver ran down his spine. Outside the window, someone was standing there. A shadowy figure, its form barely visible, but its eyes, its glowing, piercing eyes, locked onto his. David stumbled backward, his heart hammering wildly. Number. That wasn't possible. His room was on the second floor. No one could be standing outside his window. Holding his breath, he tried to steady himself. Maybe it was an illusion. He blinked rapidly, hoping that when he opened his eyes again, the figure would be gone. But it wasn't. It was still there. And then, it smiled. A grin stretched impossibly wide, grotesquely unnatural. David jerked back, nearly tripping over himself. His breath shattered, and his trembling hands gripped the edge of the bed to keep himself steady. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out. But just as he turned toward the door, knock, knock, knock! Someone was outside. David froze, cold sweat dripping down his temple. The thin wooden door was the only barrier between him and whatever was lurking beyond it. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking continued, slow, patient, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side wasn't in a hurry. He barely dared to breathe. Every muscle in his body tensed, his focus locked on the door. Then the knocking stopped. A deafening silence swallowed the room. David took a step back, inching toward the corner, never taking his eyes off the door. He knew that something was still standing there, waiting for him to make a mistake. And then, click. The doorknob turned. Someone was trying to open the door. David lunged forward, gripping the handle with all his strength, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. A force on the other side was pushing against him, twisting the knob, trying to get in. "Go away," he shouted, his voice breaking in the cramped space. But there was no response, only silence. And then slowly, the unseen hand released the knob. David remained pressed against the door, listening. Nothing. But he couldn't relax. Reaching for a rickety wooden chair nearby, he wedged it tightly under the doorknob, barricading himself inside. He needed a way out. Turning to the window, he knew he couldn't jump from the second floor, but if there was an awning or something to grab onto, he might have a chance. He yanked the curtain aside, only to freeze in place. Outside, the figure was gone. David exhaled sharply, but before he could feel any relief, he noticed something far worse. On the glass, right where the shadowy figure had been, there were marks, handprints, smudged and stretched across the surface, as if someone had pressed their palms and face against it, watching him this entire time. His stomach turned. It had been there. It had been watching him, probably long before he even noticed. No more hesitation. He had to leave. He rushed to the door, yanking the chair away and swinging it open, desperate to escape. But the moment he stepped into the hallway, it was there, standing right in front of his door, close enough that he could feel the icy presence radiating from its form. It didn't move. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a dark, distorted silhouette that seemed to absorb the very light around it. David couldn't breathe, and then it smiled. It had no lips, no face, but David felt the smile. This house, it wasn't going to let him leave that easily. David struggled to control his breathing. Every nerve in his body stretched taut as he faced the dark entity standing just outside his door. It had no eyes, no mouth, yet he felt its twisted, invisible grin surrounding him. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The figure stood motionless, as if waiting for something. David slowly backed into the room, his legs trembling as he tried to steady himself. But the moment he blinked, it was gone. No sign that it had ever been there. No sound, no movement. Only the endless pitch-black hallway stretching out before him as if it had no end. His heart pounded in his chest. That wasn't an illusion. He had seen it, felt its presence. But why? Why did it just vanish like that? A cold draft whispered through the corridor, carrying with it a faint, eerie murmur. David clenched his jaw. He couldn't stay here. He had to find a way out. Bolting down the hallway, he ran as fast as he could, not daring to look back. The doors lining the walls gaped open like empty, yawning mouths. But he didn't care. He just needed to get out. Just needed to. Then, he stopped. The reception desk was gone. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls shifting and warping with each step he took. He knew he had run in the right direction, back the way he had come. But now, nothing looked the same. No, this isn't real. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead. He turned around, desperate to go back to his room, but the door to his room was gone too. Only paintings remained, lining the walls. And this time, they weren't just watching him. They were smiling. Grotesque, unnatural smiles, stretched far beyond human limits. David stumbled back, terror gripping every inch of him. Then, from within the paintings, hands emerged. Long, spindly fingers, black as ink, crawling down the walls like monstrous spiders. David screamed, spinning around and sprinting down the endless corridor. But no matter how far he ran, the hallway never ended. He was trapped. No escape. Laughter echoed through the space, growing louder, more distorted, stretching out in an unnatural cacophony. And then, at the end of the hallway, it was there again, the tall, shadowy figure standing still, waiting. David skidded to a halt, his chest tightening. It still had no eyes, no mouth. But this time, it raised a hand and pointed directly at him. A sharp, stabbing pain shot through David's skull. Fragments of memories that weren't his flashed before his eyes. Visions of others who had stood in this exact spot, just as terrified as he was now. And then, they were gone. No one had ever escaped this place. David shook his head violently, forcing the horrifying images away. No, he would not give in. He turned, slamming his fists against the walls, desperately searching for a way out. But there was nothing, only emptiness. And then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind him. David's heart felt like it would explode. It was coming closer. There was nowhere left to run, no way out. And then, a cold hand gripped his shoulder. Darkness swallowed everything. David froze as the icy hand pressed down on his shoulder. His breath caught in his throat, every cell in his body paralyzed by fear. He didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. Even the smallest motion could be the end of him. Then, a voice echoed in his ears, drifting through the air like a cold whisper from nowhere. "You can't escape." His heart slammed against his ribs. That wasn't a normal voice. It wasn't human. It was warped, distorted, as if it had risen from the depths of the earth itself. David squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to stay calm. No, he couldn't let fear control him. He couldn't just stand here and wait to die. Summoning every ounce of courage, he suddenly jerked forward, breaking free from the grip before sprinting down the hallway. He didn't care where he was going. He just had to get away. The corridor stretched endlessly before him. The walls seemed to be closing in, as if they were trying to swallow him whole. Behind him, the darkness crept closer, chasing him like a ravenous beast. Twisted laughter echoed through the space, making every nerve in his body tighten. Then, a door appeared ahead. Without hesitation, David lunged for it, twisting the handle and throwing it open. He stumbled inside, only to find himself in a dusty, decayed room. But what sent chills down his spine were the photographs scattered across the floor. Each photo captured people who had been here before. Faces frozen in terror, expressions warped, their eyes wide with the horror of something unspeakable. David's hands trembled as he picked up one of the pictures. His knees nearly buckled when he saw. It was him, and standing right behind him. It. The shadowy figure loomed in the background of the photo, just inches away from him. No, this isn't possible. He had never taken this picture. How could... Click. The door behind him slammed shut. Darkness flooded the room. David spun around, but it was too late. It was there, blocking the only exit. There was nowhere left to run. This time, it moved. Slow, deliberate steps, closing the distance between them. David backed away, but his shoulders hit the cold wall behind him. The entity was no longer motionless. It was advancing, savoring the moment. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating darkness. It raised a hand. A sharp pain shot through David's skull. The visions came again, flashes of the ones who had stood in this very spot before him. They had run, they had fought, they had begged, but their fates were all the same. David understood now. No one ever escaped. And then, the thing placed its hand over his face. A cold, dry sensation consumed him. The world tilted. The room vanished. Everything vanished. All that remained was darkness. The next morning, the hotel staff unlocked the room David had rented. It was empty. No sign of him, as if he had never existed. But on the wall, a new photograph had appeared. A picture of David, standing there, his eyes filled with terror. And behind him, a shadowy figure. It was smiling, still waiting for the next victim.